Okay, let's get started. Welcome to a conversation about what to know when you migrate to Azure. We're going to focus this day on making sure you're prepared to take the most advantage of your Azure environment. And in particular, we're going to talk about what you need to know to be able to arm it. So when you are leveraging that environment, you've done the necessary due diligence and prep in order to execute on migrations of this nature. So introduce myself a little bit. My name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I am involved in these kinds of conversations day in and day out. I'm a Microsoft MVP for cloud. I've been that for 14 years now. Been a consultant for 21 years, and really looking forward to sharing some of these best practices with you today. As you're going, I'm happy to answer questions that come up in the chat. So as you do have those, by all means, add them to the chat. I love to do that as we go. Love to answer those questions as we're having conversations with you about this topic. This is one that has so many just well trod out best practices that exist, and looking forward to covering them. So let's get right in. So when you think about moving to Azure or moving to the cloud, a lot of the reasons why people do so kind of fit into two big buckets. And this is also the way we kind of think about our business and concurrency all up. The first bucket is this idea of I have new modern things I want to do. I'm enabling new data workloads. I'm enabling new application workloads that create new revenue or operational savings. And I need to prepare an environment that facilitates that. So I'm targeting these things up here, apps and products, data and AI workloads. But in order to do so responsibly, I need to enable a cloud transformation strategy that facilitates the necessary governance and platform and security around those workloads. So many companies look at it from that context. Companies also look at it from the context of getting out of the data center business. And that's a very common strategy that companies have, because it's not something that you need to be operating as an organization to be able to do so efficiently. There's all sorts of horror stories about people not doing that well and spending too much money in the cloud and so on. But I'm going to show you a little bit today that dispels a little bit of those myths and puts you in a position where you can run that responsibly and actually save money as a result of moving traditional workloads to the cloud as well. So we'll talk about both of those topics today and hopefully arm you to be able to take advantage of the cloud in the context that helps your business the most. So when you think about leveraging the cloud in your organization, I want you to think about it in the context of a maturity curve. Many organizations are sitting down in this sort of zone of stagnancy up to this point of just starting to leverage the cloud, but leveraging the cloud without fully operationalizing the environment. That sort of position is a space where you're starting to get excited about it. You're starting to load new workloads. You're putting data there. You're putting applications there. You're maybe looking at lifting some data center resources there, but you haven't gotten to a position where you've operationalized that and your team can run the cloud with the same level of confidence that it can run it on premise. So as a result of that, you get to a position where they don't understand how to deploy workloads, mistakes happen, data can be compromised, information can be put out to the internet in the way that they shouldn't be, and people's skills aren't aligned to being able to take most advantage of efficiencies, so you spend more money than you need to. So all the things that you want to avoid happen because you haven't put yourself in a position to be successful. So this goal of operationalizing the cloud becomes a baseline for you to be able to accelerate all the other things that you're attempting to do, such as streamlining cloud product development that would sit on top of cloud resources. So your goal is really to land inside of this box and get here as expeditiously as possible, aligned to your cloud activities that you're performing, so you can then build on that to be able to drive innovation differentiation across the organization. And what you'll notice is that as your organization starts pivoting toward a cloud-first approach, the architectures change, the skills change, the organization starts to change around technology becoming a verb within the business. It's part of how the business does what it does, rather than being this sort of thing over in the back room that IT takes care of. And it democratizes the ability to access those resources over time. So what we're going to talk about today is what are some of the steps that we need to think about as we're climbing that maturity curve, and what are the ways to avoid some of the mistakes that other companies have made. Now, in that context, I want you to think about three different horizons of how you look at your data center. The first horizon is this idea of how you've operated your data centers today, how you patch your servers, how you back up your servers, how you administer them, how you deploy them, Are they like pets, or are they like cattle, right? Are they something that you manage as a distributed automated whole, or is this something that each one is its own little special snowflake, special pet that you take care of and have to manage and kind of drag along? Is it a boat anchor like an iSeries that's sitting in your on-premise environment? So that environment exists now, and we have to think about where are we trying to take it from here. There's two potential destinations that may actually happen concurrently in your journey. The first destination is this idea of Horizon 2. Horizon 2 is this idea of taking virtual machines that exist in your existing data center and moving them into a modern operational state that takes advantage of cloud capabilities. So what I mean by that is taking advantage of the native control planes, such as cloud backup, cloud monitoring, taking advantage of infrastructure as code as a deployment vehicle, implementing micro network segmentation to be able to isolate workloads from each other. Horizon 2 migrations fail if all you did was shift from the legacy environment to the cloud and did none of that. You just move stuff from point A to point B. Okay, cool, you got out of your data center, maybe that was of value to you, but you lost an opportunity to be able to take advantage of properties that are implemented in a Horizon 2 state. And we'll talk about what some of those are. Many organizations, however, are focused on Horizon 3, or in conjunction with Horizon 2, they're focused on Horizon 3. And these are cloud-native applications that have a DevOps natural operational state. You're building things that are on containers, you're building things on cloud-native capabilities, it's a modern data state. These live in a different operational pattern than your legacy on-premise data center operations for certain, and also build on some of the skills that you would need to do Horizon 2. So like to do Horizon 2, we'd still suggest that the infrastructure deployment be handled as a DevOps pipeline. That can be easily done in a migration. That skill attaches to how you would actually accomplish that at Horizon 3, which is truly democratizing the ability to build applications and building the necessary guardrails around constructing them in a way that keeps your organization safe and reliable, but also gives developers the ability to take action and do so quickly. So we'll talk about kind of how those architectural models work as we go forward here. So as we get started, the first thing I want you to understand is that the org and skilling requirements for the cloud are going to change from how you do it today. So as you start approaching either a Horizon 2 migration, moving existing data centers there, or building new applications ground up within the cloud, your skilling requirements are going to evolve over time. And those skilling requirements are different based upon your operational models. So as you think about operational models in the cloud, there's really 4 different primary operational models that exist. The first operational model would be a decentralized operational model. That's one where everybody literally does their own thing. There's no centralized function at all. All application teams build their own capabilities, and they're free to do their own work. It's very common in very highly decentralized organizations, but it's very risky because it's dependent on this individual application team to be able to do what's right for their application and to govern it successfully. The next operational model would be central operations. Central operations is where all of the resources are managed by one central IT team. This is very similar to how you operate your on-premise data centers. Teams of IT people care for the servers and applications as a group, and it's entirely centralized within that organization. However, where we start to move toward is enterprise operations within the cloud. And enterprise operations in the cloud brings the best of decentralized and central together. It establishes a central operating function, which is described by this purple bar, but then it starts to establish application or business unit-centric landing zones that workloads are lit up in, and application teams can have autonomy, but there's still guardrails surrounding their use of that platform. So there's a centralized function that's more about governance and management and policy and guardrails. And then there's an execution function, which is about the application teams or the AI teams or the server management teams of workloads that were moved that are happening within those guardrails. This last picture is kind of like when you mix them all up, right? So like you have a company that does a lot of acquisitions. The base company has this. It acquires a company that is more decentralized or more centralized or more decentralized. And you're starting to bring those organizations into your model. And usually what you're trying to do is kind of bring them back into the enterprise model from there. But distributed operations tends to be something that can happen in very, very large organizations. If I had to focus this audience on something, it would be to focus on this number 3 picture. That is really where most organizations are going to end up landing. So how that ultimately vets out is there's 3 different primary functions that exist within a cloud governance and enablement organization. And this doesn't need to mean that you're actually restructuring your organization to have different leaders. You can and oftentimes should, but in this context, you don't necessarily have to in order to achieve the same goals. The main outcome here is to make sure these 3 functions happen, which is the establishment of governance standards, which include establishment of governance standards, project support, and enablement. So governance standards, what that function is associated with is establishing the patterns that are used by the organization to be able to adopt cloud resources. This established version-controlled standards that are released monthly. But in order to do that, they have to have a backlog that they're working against. What I see many organizations fail at is they kind of know they have to get some of these things in place, but they don't develop a backlog of what's important to them to be able to have confidence that when a project is launched within the cloud, it contains the necessary qualities that make it successful. And they don't know how to build against that. So creating a backlog for a team to work against to release version controlled standards on a monthly basis is a really important step. And then to intake into that, sort of working from our goal of establishing this, but intaking into that is this monthly stakeholder group that receives feedback, reviews progress, and prioritizes against those goals. So that means your application teams are part of that. It means your data governance, your data team is part of that. It means your AI team is part of that. They're providing input that is intake into the necessary goals. Like for example, let's say we're down the road and you want to launch an open AI service. Well, that comes in here as a requirement to say, we want to launch this. Can you establish a pattern that we can adopt to be able to do this safely? Maybe we have to implement a private link, or maybe we have to structure it in a way that we understand how the data is going to pattern around. All of that comes through that channel. So governance function is function 1. Second function is this idea of project support. So project support being, I have major projects that are happening within the organization, and I need to put myself in a position where I have a team that is assigned to help those projects be successful. Clear blockers and onboarding, technical validation of the production architecture, so they can be onboarded into the cloud in the context of these major projects that are happening. What often happens is project support sort of eats into everything else. And because companies haven't developed backlogs for governance or enablement, everything just kind of is happen like whoever screams the loudest, especially in the context of these projects. So that is function 2. Function 3 is this idea of enablement. And this is taking the standards and applying those standards and helping organizational areas, application teams or specific sub-projects to onboard into those functions, to enable them. That means you're building wiki articles and templates, you're helping them to onboard to those templates, you're engaging that capacity with those groups, and you're also performing financial operations optimization. And that is one of the more important functions of enablement, is helping everybody to save money. There's about 20 to 40% of the cloud spend that is waste. I'll say that again, 20 to 40% of cloud spend is waste. And FinOps is how we attack it and cut that down to a very nominal level. And most of the time, the 20 to 40% is made up of a healthy chunk, well over 50%, that can be attacked by simply applying reservations and right-sizing kind of activities or license activities that don't take a lot of architectural changes, but simply take applying the right kind of model to that cost. So enablement is one of the more important functions because it helps us apply the cloud successfully from a cost standpoint. Some anti-patterns that you should avoid in this space are to misunderstand where shared responsibilities come into play. So there are shared responsibilities that change across the overall ecosystem as you go into Azure or into any cloud solution, right? So cloud security would be an example of that. When you move from a centralized model to a to an enterprise model, you get yourself in a position where responsibilities start to change in terms of who has some accountability into the security picture, for example. And understanding that new picture of responsibilities is critical to having a successful outcome in that space. The second is to assume that just what gets deployed as a ClickOps next is going to be secure. Many solutions are built very securely, but they also have a lot of configuration that can be done to them to put them in a more secure state. So don't just assume that whatever someone can deploy by click, or like deploying the base configuration is the most secure configuration. Take that very intentionally. And then the third is using custom compliance or governance frameworks. There's so much best practices that have been built around the cloud adoption framework that start with that as a pattern, leverage things like the NIST or 800-171 as starting points for your policies, and don't feel like you have to create them all from scratch. Like, pull from those and then adjust them slightly as necessary, but don't think that you have to create something completely custom just for your business to be successful. Note that there's a number of sets of training that would be helpful for your teams as they start to onboard. Developers, engineers, people who are managing the resources. There's some great training that's available for them to onboard into the base skills necessary to leverage Azure and for them to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. And of course, there's more training outside of these, but this is a great kind of channel for baseline capabilities for people to say, all right, cool. Like, not only do I have the fundamentals in place, but I have some very direct skills in the capability that's being asked of me in the context of the work that I'm going to be doing. So don't forget that in the context of the role level guides. So what I usually find is the best strategy here is to take all the job descriptions associated with people in your team, especially ones that are focusing on new cloud-centric capabilities. Reset those job descriptions around a new role level guide that builds these capabilities into their skilling plan and the requirements for their job. And you set a path for them to be able to learn those skills over a period of time that let them get to a position of success. And you give them the necessary training to be able to get to that position. That helps your people go from where they are today, which may not be like having the necessary skills to be successful, to getting to a point where they have those skills. Remember, though, that nobody, or very rarely do people become truly competent in these capabilities unless they're actually doing it. So if you intend to like take an engineer who is like not doing cloud things and have them do a bunch of certifications and all of a sudden be excellent, like, it's not going to happen. Like, they need to be involved in a migration or in a new project or new build, something, the governance implementation, something that enables them to gain the skills by practically doing it and practically managing it in addition to the book knowledge. Okay, number 2, we're going to talk about establishing governance and management framework and how that ultimately fits into the picture. So I'm going to start by walking through what a bad structure would be for your Azure topology. So many organizations started with something like this. They have a minimal number of subscriptions, say 1, 2, 3 subscriptions, and they call that like prod and dev and QA or whatever. And then they consolidated a lot of their capabilities into that subscription, and then they used resource groups to be able to do everything else. So like prod, dev, QA, they're all resource groups. And that strategy is not the recommended pattern for scaling in Azure environments. And I'll show you why in a second. But and it's very right. What it does is it establishes the much more complexity to manage the independence of different applications, business stakeholders, cost, scale out in a place that really isn't appropriate. And it leaves you vulnerable to subscription limits that are going to block you and prevent you from being successful, as well as introducing risk by having too many people operating in too close of a pattern with each other. Like Corp IT right next to business units just doesn't work. So you're putting yourself in a structure that's not going to scale. Second thing you don't want is just subscriptions without any structure around them. Like when we first got started in Azure, what is a very new thing, there was no way to establish structure around subscriptions. So people just had subscriptions and no structure, and it was really chaotic. So we don't want that either. So this would be what we call CAF, Cloud Adoption Framework Consistent Structure. This is right out of Microsoft Learn. I'm not customizing this at all. So what you have is a tenant root group that contains your name of company. And then you have management groups that break out the major buckets, platform being IT platform functions, landing zones, which are where your applications go, decommissioned, which are decommissioned subscriptions, and sandbox, which is, think about it as the playground. It's the place where people can build things without having to have as many walls around them. They can just do stuff, build it, tear it down, build it, tear it down. Oftentimes, sandbox subscriptions are built to automatically self-destruct after a period of time. It's like, yeah, go do stuff out here for 30 days, and then after that, it's going to self-destruct and you get a new one, like something around those lines. That's the whole reason why it's called sandbox, right? The waves wash it away. You never have permanency there. On the other hand, on the left-hand side here, we have much more permanency. So identity is a management group that contains an identity subscription. This is where your Windows domain controllers go. It's where your Azure identity functions go. You have your management subscription, which is for things like log analytics and monitoring, centralized backup. You have your connectivity subscription, which is associated with building connectivity to the on-prem network. So if you said on-prem, think of that as a hub and spoke. This is the hub. And then the landing zones are the spokes. So landing zones could be one of two things. It might be a landing zone, and think of these as subscriptions, okay? So, and this may be like blowing everyone's mind, but every application gets its own subscription. And actually, every application probably gets 3 subscriptions. It gets a prod, dev, and QA. Don't believe me? Check out the Microsoft Learn material on Cloud Adoption Framework. This is by far the best scale pattern. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, especially because of how it allows us to leverage out-of-box roles for managing the landing zones themselves. So let's take these as an example. A landing zone that is connecting to on-premise will interact with the hub subscription to hit the on-premise environment. And a landing zone over here, you'll notice that there's Corp. Corp would be a landing zone that is intended as an on-premise application. That does not have internet connectivity. Online, on the other hand, would be an application that is internet-facing. That type of landing zone potentially is never connected to the hub subscription because it doesn't ever talk to on-premise. Now, you might have a sort of back end of that has to hit on-premise, and that's another type of connection that we would manage. But both of those are segregated between each of their 2 main spots. You also notice that like a major platform might get its own landing zone. Or one thing that came up in a conversation yesterday was like a back-end service, like something like an API or a long-running process might set in its own landing zone approach because of the way that you're governing and applying policy. The main point of the delineation of landing zone types is so you can apply different policy to those subscription sets. Now, how this all fits into the bigger picture, what we just looked at is right here, okay? So the blown out version of that is identity subscription, management subscription, connectivity, landing zone, sandbox. Man, I wish I had this 5 years ago when we started doing Azure projects, because at that point, everything was kind of like best practices based on who did it last and like kind of coming up with, everyone was developing their own strategy and their own best practices. And there was a lot of good practices, but I'd say best practices were still sort of evolving. As we've had the opportunity to contribute to and be part of the Cloud Adoption Framework, this has established some great patterns that enable us to be able to scale and rely upon those patterns and training that people get that aligns with them. So a lot of great opportunities for us to leverage what has been successful in many organizations now. So a couple different examples that you might want to think about in this context. So scenario 1 would be something like an internal facing app. I bring this up because I think it's important for you to understand that like there's a topology context that you should understand around applications as they are deployed in your environment. So internal facing apps, that sort of corp management group we talked about, is one where you start as an internal user, you have connectivity through your connectivity subscription, and then you have applications that are essentially sitting like private endpoints that are on your internal corporate WAN. They are internal applications sitting on your internal network that connect to internal things. And that topology works pretty well for applications that just straight up should never be on the internet. However, there's other models that you can follow for internet-facing applications, and that's scenario 2A and 2B. 2A follows a lot of the same practices, but uses but established as a public endpoint for external application users to be able to interact with the internet. And that's by using platforms like Front Door to be able to expose those. Scenario 2B, on the other hand, says, well, I don't know if I really even need to use internal endpoints. Why don't I just use external endpoints and then facilitate access to that? This is probably the most common model for modern development. So most modern application development is following a like non-internal endpoint type scenario in doing it such that you have a public endpoint and applications are accessing it in a secure way. Why do I bring these up? Well, I bring these up because if we go back a second, the reason why we have corp and online is when I use those two different models, I apply different policies to those. So the big question is like, how do I ensure that those are both deployed successfully? The way you do it in the cloud is not by like going out and looking at them. You deploy in the cloud by building policy that attaches here and here to be able to ensure that what gets deployed there, A, can't be deployed unless it passes certain requirements, and then also has an audit attached to it, so it alerts you if something hasn't been deployed successfully when you're doing it in audit mode. So one of the core tenets of cloud-based deployments is we build policy to look for the things and to block the things that we don't want people doing. So whether you're using scenario 1, scenario 2A, or 2B, you're putting yourself in a position where policies applying things that say, how is this protected? How is this protected? We implement policy to ensure that happens. Okay, recommendation number 4. Let's talk about adopting modern deployment practices. Well, how does that fit into the picture? So recommendation number 4 is really about starting with the beginning. So one of the things that companies have done, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, is to build a service provisioning hierarchy that gives the business an understanding of what are my technology assets and how does it relate to the jobs that we're doing. So think about like an application list. If you ever did a backup and recovery exercise, you probably made a list of every application in your organization and how critical it was and how you recovered it to a new location and who the owners of it were and who tests it and all these things, right? We do that a lot when we do M&A projects, like we're combining two companies or merging them or separating them. You have to have a list of all the applications that you're going to move and what's dependent on it. Well, most companies don't have that list that they maintain successfully, and this is a great time to start it. So you want to have the list of those applications, and then you want to relate that to this idea of a business service. What is the business service that's consuming those applications? And then above that exists something called a job to be done. And a job to be done is the ultimate job that the person who's performing an activity is doing. Like, I need to connect these two things, and I rely upon this business service to facilitate me doing that. Or I need to place I need to create a new loan for someone, or I need to ship this boat to a customer, or I need to produce this set of lumber products. All of that is a job to be done. And if your service is not successful, that person can't do the job to be done. So sometimes companies start up here and work their way down. Sometimes they start down here at the data domain level, like the functional data level, and they work their way up. Ultimately, what we need to be successful in our cloud journey is this middle zone. And at minimum, even just this application tier to be able to facilitate provisioning, because that creates all these things. So you say like, man, how do I avoid cost problems? How do I avoid problems where a critical application is exposed to the wrong people or endpoints expose the internet when it shouldn't be? Or how do I think about the data criticality redundancy plan? Well, sometimes those are dealt with as symptoms rather than actually originating problems. And dealing with them as originating problems or origination of like the core thing is where service provisioning comes in. When we start provisioning something in the cloud, we want to capture all these elements that facilitate us downstream being able to be successful. Service name, application name, owner, technical lead, the cost center, the data security level, all of these move down the stream to facilitate service creation into approval, person saying, yes, this is okay to move down the line. And maybe I'm routing one to online and I'm routing one to corp based upon certain checkboxes that exist at this level. And then that moves into provisioning, which then contains these things. So provisioning's goal then is to take what we know about the service and move that into tagging that's attached with subscriptions as well as resource groups inside the context of it. So that then moves us into, how do I provision? Well, the number one thing I want you to avoid when you're provisioning is something called ClickUps, like going to a portal, click, 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 I'm provisioning something, and that's the successful deployment pattern. Why do you avoid that? Because it's not scalable, it's difficult to recover. The only person who knew what they clicked on is the person that did the clicking, and it's not building up modern deployment practices that are much more successful at being able to tear down and repeat and redeploy an environment from a secure state. So your goal destination should virtually always be that your Azure portal for dev, QA, prod is view only. The sandbox, go click ops to your heart's content. But if you're deploying in the context of any of those other three, your Azure portal should largely be view only, and your deployment pattern is happening via source code or an infrastructure as code-based deployment for like traditional virtual machines that then partner with the control plane, ARM or Bicep, through policy into all of the service provisioning process, a modification to an existing deployed environment, or even deletion. This is where you want to land. This is how you build out an environment that's sustainable over time. So that fits into a much more detailed picture of building applications, starting with work intake. That's attached to work that's done in Azure DevOps. That then flows into code that's managed and flows into building and releasing and flows into operating. It all connects together. And if you bring these pictures together, you execute them in that way, you'll be much more successful long term. It may take more time to spin up initially, but you'll definitely be more successful long term as you go to be building these cloud native applications. At the Horizon 2 state, same kind of idea happens. You're essentially deploying your virtual machines and then refactoring them around this context. And you're building it in a way that, like, okay, I've got a virtual machine running in Azure, and it's like a regular dumb Windows virtual machine that's got an app installed in it. But the configuration of the VM itself, its CPU, its storage amount, its RAM, all this stuff, right? All that can be built still through an infrastructure as code pipeline. And the reason why that's important is because then the right configuration of it is stored as code. If someone jacks it up, you can always go back to the good version. If you weren't doing it as code, it's difficult to go back to the good version because you never know what it was. So Horizon 2 oftentimes builds in some of these qualities, certainly not like the code on the application itself because you're not in control of it. But for the kind of baseline deployment, it's very successful. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about policy and tagging. I think this is an important thing for everyone to understand because it's how we build the guardrails for your Azure environment. So we talked a little bit earlier that tagging is a result of service configuration. So you having this front end of understanding the context of the service, and remember, you could do that almost anywhere. Like there's an area in ServiceNow to build that service definition. People do it in Power Apps. People build custom apps. Could be almost anything to be able to construct that service. That is the intaking into deploying tagging, and then policies then look for those tags to be able to apply in them. So policies are then applying based upon classification or SLA or backup or control against that to then result in outcomes. Too many people start here, like it costs too much, or it's not secure, or my tagging doesn't show the right things. Like, yeah, it doesn't because you didn't start here. Start at the beginning with the right information, funnel that down through the pattern, and then be in a position where the outcomes match what you're looking to achieve. This is an example of tag values. I won't go into all these, but just know that like there's best practices on how you might build out those accepted tag values in the context of your environment. So application, business unit, cost center, etc. There's some customization around, and then things like automation exempt or criticality or redundancy. You can take advantage of some kind of well-accepted tag values to be able to start you on your journey. When I think about policy, I usually think about policy in the context of taking advantage of what's been done before to get us going. So apply things like NIST 800-153 as a audit-based deployment, same with the Azure Security Benchmark, and then one of the Kubernetes baselines, and then applying your unique policies like tagging and resource and region limits, as well as networking topology limits into that V1 policy. And then from there, you can start to move that policy into action mode, like where it won't let people deploy if it doesn't match. You can iterate on an earlier tag resources. What I'll say is the hardest thing to do is to go back to an Azure environment that wasn't tagged properly and try to fix it. And the number one time I run into that is when the costs are out of control and leadership is saying, well, why are my Azure costs so high? And you can't associate those Azure costs back to originating owners or applications because that work wasn't done. So you have to spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out who owns what apps are associated with what, who has the right to even shut it off, what happens if I shut it off. Nobody knows. So doing this up front is super important to be able to drive action on the cost side later on. Okay, number six is understanding the cost model for the cloud. This is FinOps. This is doing things well. So when we think about understanding the cost model for the cloud, this is really like when you start planning your migration, okay? So if you starting to plan a migration, you need to think about it in the context of a couple of different things. First is, what's my original state, okay? So where did I start from? So maybe on the containers front, I'm starting here, or maybe on SQL, I'm starting on a Windows SQL cluster, or my Windows servers are basically running in VMware, or my backup platform is this on-premise backup platform, or I'm doing SCCM or SCOM for monitoring and patching, or SolarWinds or something, right? I've got an original state that sits in. This is your sort of horizon 2 state, okay? You're saying, where am I going from there? So maybe I have some containers and they can go straight to AKS, or this lift's pretty straightforward. This goes as Azure VM in Azure. This goes to Azure Backup. I don't need my on-premise backup platform anymore. Update management goes straight to Azure Update Management. Azure Monitor replaces SCOM. The migrated environment represents a modernized version of what I was doing before, such as here, where I'm implementing infrastructure as code around it, as well as implementing network segmentation around the migrated workload. You need to lay out that, like, this is where I'm moving toward, and I'm not considering it successful until I've done these things, because you want to have duplicative costs within the environment. Now, as environments exist, you can also target refactoring. So, for example, a file server, I'd move straight to Azure Files because it's so much more efficient. There's no reason to move the file server. I can actually lift that straight to Azure Files and then use archive storage to gain quite a bit of cost savings. Same kind of idea with Azure Container Apps, or for Kubernetes services. I can start to move straight to ACA. So there's opportunities for me to do refactoring operations, or something that's not on this list would be something like Azure Virtual Desktop. Quite often we see huge banks of Citrix or remote desktop servers, and instead of moving those, we're implementing things like Azure Virtual Desktop as part of the migration. So think about that as like part of the context of how you look at it. You need to understand also how the costs factor into what it is I'm actually building. So if you think about pay-as-you-go, this is always the most expensive cost. Pay-as-you-go means like I'm making zero commitment to what the long-term vision of this looks like. That then moves into reservations, which is basically when you say, okay, cool, I'm going to reserve a certain amount of capacity, and by reserving that, I'm going to get cost savings simply as a result of reserving. And then you have the right size angle, which is where you start to take advantage of, like, wow, like on-premise, I scale it like this. I don't even use those resources. Now I can start to move it down this path. So yeah, if you deploy this in the cloud, it's going to be more expensive than on-premise. If you go down reservation or right sizing paths, you're going to save money versus replacement costs. And the main reason is when you buy your hardware on-premise, you buy it at the max on. When you buy it in the cloud, you have the opportunity to drive efficiency. The problem is that people don't drive efficiency. They don't apply reservations. They don't apply right sizing. They don't apply the opportunities to be able to get more out of the platform. And that's where the waste happens. So this is really a call to think about the FinOps story. And we'll talk about that in a second. So patterns of migration, let's talk about that. So a couple of things to think about when you're preparing your migration activities. So this could be more for the Horizon 2 scenarios. There's also the refactor story. First is grouping applications into common waves. As you're doing broader migration stories, you have to group applications and application owners together so they can move in patterns that are successful. And I'll show you an example of that in a second, but you're doing it in a way that allows you to be able to say, okay, here's my group of application testers. I know who those testers are because I've gone and I've inventoried them all, and I put myself in a position where I can be successful with that. Probably the hardest part of migration isn't actually the migration. Like actually moving and being successful at that is pretty simple. The hard part is understanding what the hell applications a company has and knowing how they relate to the right application owners, because again, that service stuff hasn't been done on the front end. People always think they know what applications they have, but then they actually have like 7 different lists, and it takes so much time to get those 7 different lists organized into one because nobody's done it before. So that's the most important upfront activity. Identifying the context of those move periods or pause periods, understanding the validation for each workload, and then planning a replication time and post-migration monitoring attached to that. So that ultimately sits in this idea of planning migration waves, where you group workloads together into migrations and you understand how they fit from a cost perspective over that period of time. So you might see, for example, maybe SAP is coming at the end, whereas some of these lower priority workloads happen up front because it's the right kinds of things to move. Okay, number 8, FinOps. FinOps, I think, is like the most important activity for any organization to have right as they are onboarding into Azure. And what FinOps is essentially about is being able to look at this picture and say, okay, I understand. These pictures tell me about what time frame I have, what service family I'm looking at, what the what the budget looks like, or the projected budget looks like over the course of the month, who's spending it, how are they spending it, like how are they spending it, who's spending it, and all that factoring into a breakdown that I can understand in the context of my organization. The most successful organizations in cost analysis and cost management shift the costs from IT to direct business units. The alignment of responsibility and authority to a P&L is the most significant determinant of whether you can do this well or not, because it puts the person who's responsible for the application directly aligned to the cost of that application, and they care about it. The organizations that hold this all in IT struggle because the rest of the business doesn't care about the cost. They're like, not really. They don't really care. So there's an opportunity here for you to be able to put this in a position where you've distributed those costs to the right owners. They're accountable for driving optimization, and you partner them with a FinOps organization that's creating those right outcomes. So how do you do that? Well, you capture it, route it for chargeback. That's important. Recommended charges go to direct business areas. The owner in the service registry matches the accountable party, and the Center of Excellence or Cloud Governance team works with that owner to reduce costs. So you go from the Azure Billing API, you route it, cost center goes to the P&L, and then shared costs are also distributed as a percentage of those overall costs. You're distributing that as a component of the overall picture. Now, why is this successful? Because it, again, aligns responsibility and authority in the right places and puts you in a position where you can be successful at reducing costs over time. So a couple ways to break this out. One is phase 1, establish a team and responsibility that is going to engage with those parts of the organization to help drive down costs. Assign concrete time to that person for cost reduction. This doesn't happen unless it happens. Okay, like you may think cost reduction is important, but if you don't actually give time to a person to go do that task, cost reduction won't happen because nobody's spending time on it. And you might see, oh man, there's that cost again. But unless someone actually commits time to it, the cost reduction exercises don't occur. Measure that reduction from a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 1 year, and so on type of reduction pattern. Ultimately, scaling the application of time to cost reduction needs to directly align to a 2x reduction of FinOps costs. So if I'm going to apply $10,000 to reducing costs within my organization by staffing or consultants, whatever, it's anybody, however you're doing it, it needs to result in $20,000 of cost reduction activities that happen within the business. And really what you're trying to do is not only pay for it, but pay for it double as a result of applying that activity. Now you might say like, well, I don't even need to, like, maybe I should go for more. Like, sure, go for more. But at minimum, you need to make sure it matches. Because if you're just applying people to look at it and have conversations and it never really actually results in cost reduction, well, you've lost. There's no point. Like, what's the point of applying people to do FinOps cost reduction if it doesn't actually result in a reduction? This is part of the goal. What I can tell you is that 2x is a pretty low goal. Like, you can do a lot more because there's a lot of waste in large Azure environments. Really, any cloud environment. Consistently manage it, consistently review it, and include all cost reduction techniques as in the scope of how the team works with those business units or application teams. Even if the application teams are in IT, still give them the opportunity to be able to work with that FinOps organization to A, reduce the cost, and B, make sure that application team, even if it's in IT, is held accountable to the cost that it is producing. That's taken away from what else the organization can do with that capital. Okay, finally, build and manage this from a backlog. Your backlog should contain these 4 things. You should have activities that are associated with governance, activities that are associated with project support, activities with enablement, and activities with FinOps. And all of these are activities that are necessary within your cloud organization. If you don't do them, you're going to suffer in one of those spots. If you don't apply governance, you're going to have an environment that isn't secure and doesn't have the policies and frameworks, which will result in challenging project support and enablement activities, as well as challenging FinOps. If you only have governance, maybe someone has a difficult time getting their project through your walls, right? You need to help them. Same thing with the enablement story. Like, I've seen organizations that have built the wall, but they've never actually gone out and helped the organizations to enable them to take advantage of the cloud. So they just go around it. They're like, oh yeah, whatever. It's too restrictive, so I'm going to go over here. And that happens all the time. So there needs to be a pairing between governance and enablement that comes together to be able to build something that's sustainable for the organization. And then this last item is FinOps, which we just talked about. You have to apply energy to FinOps. So financial optimization. So you're putting yourself in a position where you're not throwing bad money after bad money. Like, how often do I see it that like applications are left on, data environments are left on, people don't even work here anymore and they've spun stuff up. That stuff just wastes money, and you can use it on much more powerful, beneficial things to the organization. So this is a responsibility of everyone that uses the cloud, but it won't happen unless IT has a function that is accountable for FinOps activities. All right, so how do you take this forward? And I'm going to break down like how I would suggest anybody who's on this call today take action. Well, the first is to run some level of Azure assessment. Now, what running that means can fit into 2 boxes. One might be like, I am intending to get out of this data center. I'm intending to position myself to be out of certain data centers over a period of time, or I want to take incremental steps. That's where you run an assessment to be able to put together the right pattern to be able to do a move like that. The second thing you might be doing is refactoring a set of applications. Maybe your goal isn't to like lift and shift your applications. Maybe it's to take applications that already exist, build refactored versions of them that live in the cloud. That's great too. That's also really standing up and assessing it to understand what that long-term vision looks like. So that's something that we do quite often, and it's a great way to get started. And there's also a lot of funding there for significant applications or migrations for Microsoft to pay for some of that work. So it's a good place to start. Second thing is to prepare your enterprise environment. Nothing should go in your cloud unless your cloud's ready to receive it. It's like putting stuff in a data center without locked doors, right? We wouldn't do that, right? We wouldn't leave our entire, we wouldn't leave the doors to our organizations wide open, waiting for someone just to walk in and pull things out, right? We would lock the doors. We'd ensure people are the right people. We have passwords and policies that for accessing applications. Oftentimes, those are a lot weaker than we think they are. We need to prepare for enterprise governance to exist so we can actually move or light up new workloads there. Be responsible. That's what number 2 is. Number 3 is enable refactored workloads. This is building new things. This is refactoring existing things. This is like lighting up Azure Virtual Desktop instead of RDS on-premise or Citrix. It's lighting up Azure Files instead of moving your file servers. It's taking advantage of Azure Active Directory instead of thinking so much about Windows Active Directory servers. It's enabling that refactored workload. And then the 4th is this idea of migrating aged data centers. A lot of times you have knocked out a number of those things here in the refactoring zone. So by the time you're moving things that you simply don't want to have in that colo anymore, or you don't want to be in a position where you have to buy new hardware for this location because you know that like this is going to start to take more and more of the things that you built. You're moving to SaaS, you're moving to cloud native capabilities, but you need to still kind of take care of these lagging factors over time. And you want them more secure. You don't want them to be in a position where they can be easily ransomware or taken advantage of in your on-premise environment because you don't have network segmentation or you haven't built up infrastructure as code-based approaches, or you're not like wanting to go and renew certain hardware that you didn't want over time, or you don't have the flexibility. Moving to migrating an aged data center over to something like Azure is a great option, and it does provide savings over a period of time as well. So any one of these 4 things are things we'd love to help you with. Typically, we're starting over here, right? We're starting with like, let's run an assessment. Let's strategize on what the right thing is. What is right for the business? And then let's talk about how we get the enterprise governance to a good position so these latter things can be done successfully. All right. Well, hopefully that was helpful for everyone to be able to have a perspective of how you take advantage of your Azure environment today. I'd love to do have some of these conversations around next steps. And we'll see you at the next presentation. Our next presentation is around artificial intelligence. So we'd love for you to join that to talk more about how you can take advantage of that in your environment. And when you do, think about it in the context of making sure that you have a prepared enterprise governance and environment for you to run it in. So have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to seeing you next time.